So listen closely. When darkness wraps the world and dreams begin to stir, you've arrived at the right place. Welcome to Between Dreams and Shadows, the sanctuary of stories that live between sleep and the unknown. Here, every tale is more than a story. It's a portal to hidden worlds, forgotten secrets, whispers from beyond, and shadows that speak as your eyes begin to close. If you're drawn to mysteries, haunting legends, and stories that send shivers down your spine, this channel is your new nighttime ritual. Before we begin, I invite you to become part of this growing nightbound community. Subscribe now and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a tale. New stories drop regularly, always under the veil of night. Like this video if you enjoy that chill before sleep. It helps this channel grow and lets me bring you deeper, darker stories. Drop a comment below. Have you ever had a strange dream? Or felt something watching in the dark? Your experience might inspire the next tale now. Take a deep breath, turn off the lights, leave the world behind, and get ready to drift between dreams and shadows. Setting the atmosphere, the room was too quiet. Not the comforting quiet that settles into the walls of a home late at night, but the kind of silence that feels rehearsed, like the world was holding its breath. Elias lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small apartment, where moonlight slanted through the blinds like thin silver bars. The clock on the nightstand glowed to 13 a.m. He hadn't fallen asleep yet. He wasn't sure he could anymore. Something had changed. It began 3 nights ago, with a dream that didn't feel like a dream. He had woken up gasping, the air around him thick with something unseen, as if the shadows in the corners of his room had been watching him. He couldn't remember the details of that first dream, only that it ended with a low whisper brushing across his ear. There were no words, just the cold impression that something knew his name. Now, the feeling followed him into his waking hours. By day, Elias worked as a graphic designer, ordinary man, living in an ordinary city, surrounded by the familiar hum of human life. But at night, when the city dimmed and the buildings turned into silhouettes, he felt the atmosphere thicken, almost like it was trying to push him into sleep, or something else. The apartment, once his sanctuary, had grown foreign to him. The furniture looked exactly the same. The light switches clicked as they always did, but the air was different, dense, expectant, like he was never truly alone anymore. Tonight was the worst it had been. As he lay still, trying to slow the galloping thoughts in his head, he realized he hadn't heard the refrigerator hum in hours, or the heater click, or even the muffled sounds of neighbors through the walls. There was just silence, as if something beyond the edges of perception had muted the world, waiting to be noticed. His eyes fluttered shut for a moment, but the darkness behind them felt deeper than it should have. Not restful, black and pressing, like standing at the edge of an endless tunnel. He opened them quickly. Then, he saw it, only for a second. At the edge of his visions, something moved across the far side of the room, near the closet. He snapped his head toward it, but there was nothing. Just the familiar coat rack, the shut closet door, and the weak blue glow of the clock. But Elias's heart didn't agree with his eyes. It thudded heavily, aware of something his mind hadn't yet accepted. He sat up slowly, brushing a hand through his hair, breathing deeply. Maybe it's just the stress, he thought. Maybe it's just my imagination. But a whisper stirred deep inside him. Not a voice, but a suggestion. No, something is watching. And that whisper wasn't from his mind. The first signs of disturbance the following day moved like a blur through Elias's mind. He sat at his desk, mechanically dragging shapes across his computer screen, but none of it registered. His colleagues' voices sounded distant, submerged in static. Every reflective surface from the window to his coffee mugs seemed to twitch at the edge of his vision, like something was just barely hidden, waiting for his gaze to falter. By the time he got home, the weight of that unseen presence had grown. His apartment welcomed him with an unnatural stillness. Too intact, too staged, like a set waiting for a scene to begin. Elias didn't turn on the lights. He didn't need to. The half-light from the city filtered in, and he preferred the shadows. Now less chance of seeing things that shouldn't be there. That night, it began again. He noticed it first in the kitchen. A spoon, left beside the sink, now sat upright in the dish rack as if it had been placed there with intention. He hadn't moved it. In fact, he hadn't used it. He stared at it for a long moment, his breath hitching, unsure if he should laugh or run. In the hallway, the light bulb began to flicker faintly, though it had worked perfectly for months. Each pulse of dim light painted the walls with elongated, shivering shadows. One of them didn't disappear when the light blinked out. It simply stood still. Too still. Elias stepped back into his room and shut the door behind him. His bed was cold, not just from the lack of warmth, but as if it had been occupied by something that had no heat of its own. The air smelled faintly metallic, like iron and static. A breeze brushed across his ankles, even though the windows were shut. As he pulled the covers around himself, something made him glance toward the closet door again. It was ajar. He never left it open. Inside, the dark was thick, like a pool of ink untouched by the moonlight. He stared into it for what felt like minutes, waiting for his mind to betray him with shapes that weren't real. But this time, it didn't have to. Something clicked inside. Not a sound, a shift, a realization. The closet wasn't empty. It knew he was looking. He shut his eyes tightly and whispered to himself, "It's not real. It's just in my head." But deep down, he knew the lie wouldn't hold. That night, Elias dreamed again, but not of landscapes or nonsense symbols. He saw his apartment, perfectly intact. He stood in the kitchen, and something stood behind him in the reflection of the microwave's metal surface. He turned around in the dream, and there was no one there. He woke with a gasp. A soft clink echoed from the kitchen. The spoon had fallen. The sound that shouldn't exist. Elias sat up in bed, the sound still ringing faintly in his ears like the echo of metal meeting porcelain. The kind of sound you'd forget in an ordinary context, but in the silence that had haunted his nights, it was deafening. The kitchen was just a few steps from his bedroom, but the hallway stretched unnaturally in the dark. He grabbed his phone for light. As its glow illuminated the path ahead, he noticed something that hadn't been there before. A faint smear on the floor, wet and glistening, ran from the edge of the closet door, across the hallway, and toward the kitchen. It looked like water, at least, that's what he told himself. He followed it cautiously as he reached the kitchen entrance. The overhead light flickered once, and then steadied without being turned on. That alone made his skin prickle. But then came the sound again, whispered out low. Hollow, not quite a voice. More like a vibration in the bones of his skull. He froze. It hadn't come from the kitchen. It was everywhere, as if the very walls were murmuring. There were no words, just a cadence. A rhythm, like something was trying to speak through a layer too thick to pierce. And it was getting closer. Elias stepped backward, heart pounding, eyes wide as his flashlight scanned the kitchen. Everything looked in place, except the spoon. It was lying on the floor again, at an angle that suggested it hadn't just fallen, but had been dropped. Purposefully. The whispers grew sharper, like the scraping of fingernails, inside his mind. He turned off the flashlight instinctively. Darkness suddenly felt safer, in the pitch black. He stood motionless, then he heard it, a breath, right beside his left ear, not his own. He spun, stumbling into the hallway, heart thundering in his chest. The walls around him seemed to pulse, as if something enormous and unseen was just behind the surface, pressing to break through. The breath had shape, intelligence, intention. Elias reached for the light switch but didn't flip it. A deep fear, rooted in his gut, told him not to illuminate what was already so close. The silence returned, but it felt thick, charged with a waiting energy. Back in his room, He slammed the door shut and leaned against it, gasping. His phone buzzed in his hand. A notification. Voice memo. New recording. He didn't remember recording anything. Trembling, he opened the app. The timestamp read 2:47 a.m., the exact moment he had heard the breath. He hit play. The audio began with static. Then, slowly, a distorted whisper. He's awake. The phone slipped from his fingers, crashing to the floor. Elias didn't move. Couldn't. Not even to breathe. Because somewhere in the corner of the room, he heard it again. A second whisper. Closer now. Keep watching. The presence without a face. Elias didn't sleep. He couldn't. Not after hearing that voice. He sat curled in the corner of his bed, back pressed against the wall, phone lying face down on the carpet. The screen had cracked on impact, but it was the least of his concerns. Every instinct in him screamed one truth. He was not alone. The room felt occupied, not by something that breathed or walked, but by something more insidious, something that lurked in the folds between moments. Slipping just outside the reach of vision, it didn't creak the floorboards or cast shadows, like a person would. No, this thing respected the rules of dreams, not of physics, and yet it was real. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time bent strangely in that darkness. Eventually, dawn began to stain the sky, a pale gray, but the apartment remained dim, almost like light had grown reluctant to touch this place. That morning, Elias noticed things had moved. Again, the cup he left on the kitchen counter was now on the windowsill. The closet door, which he remembered closing, was open, just enough to suggest an invitation, and his desk chair had rotated to face his bedroom door, as if something had been watching him sleep. But what chilled him most was the mirror. He had one hanging in the hallway, a plain, rectangular thing he rarely looked into. Today, though, he couldn't help it. As he passed it, a flicker in the reflection caught his eye. He paused, backed up, looked again. There was no figure, no face, but something was wrong. The reflection lagged only slightly, but unmistakably. When he tilted his head to the side, the mirrored version of him followed a heartbeat too late. Elias stared. That was when he noticed. The version of him in the mirror wasn't blinking. He stumbled back, breathing hard. Then, without thinking, he draped a towel over the glass and turned away. As he did, a whisper barely audible seeped from behind the fabric. "Don't cover me." He didn't turn around. That day, Elias didn't leave the apartment. Every room felt infested with a presence that had no form. Sometimes he could feel it behind him, just at the edge of sensation, a pressure on the back of his neck, a soft displacement of air, the sudden urge to turn around fast before something could vanish, and when he didn't react, it would punish him with a more intimate reminder, like the time he left the bathroom. Mirror uncovered for 2 minutes. When he returned, written in the condensation was a phrase, simple and small. "You saw me once, you'll see me again." His heartbeat never truly calmed after that. Even during the day, the apartment's corners seemed to breathe. The lights dimmed and brightened in a slow, pulsing rhythm, as though syncing with a presence that waited not for a mistake, but for submission. And Elias knew. It didn't need a face, it needed attention, because every time he acknowledged it, even with fear, it grew stronger. The unspoken warning, it was around 3 a.m. again when Elias awoke to the sound of dripping. Drip, drip, drip. He stared at the ceiling in the dark, too afraid to move. The sound wasn't from the bathroom. It wasn't even wet. It had that rhythmic quality, yes, but it echoed like something artificial, like fingers tapping slowly on hollow wood. Drip, drip, drip. Then it stopped. Elias held his breath. His eyes adjusted to the dark. He scanned the room, and that's when he saw it. On the far wall, just above his dresser, a new pattern had appeared, thin, vertical scratches, perfectly spaced, and too deliberate to be accidental. 5 lines, then a space, then 5 more, each carved shallowly into the plaster. as if something had marked its presence, counted days, or visits. He didn't move closer. He didn't want to know. Instead, he backed into the hallway. His breath fogged slightly, and that same metallic taste filled his mouth, cold and static, like the air before a thunderstorm. The hallway mirror, still covered, was humming, not loudly, barely audible, like a wire vibrating deep within the walls. He knew, if he removed the towel, the humming would grow louder. He also knew something would be waiting, so he did single quotes, T, instead. He turned to the living room and paused. On the coffee table, placed with unnatural care, was a note. Elias had no memory of writing it. His handwriting, but not his hand. It read, "You invited it." He picked up the note with shaking fingers. The paper was cold, too cold. As he turned it over, a symbol had been etched into the back. A small circle, surrounded by lines that mimicked eyes without pupils. He'd never seen it before, but the moment he touched it, a sharp sound stabbed through his ears, like pressure exploding inward. He dropped the paper. It landed face up. The lights flickered. His vision blurred. For a split second, the room appeared different, not distorted, not like a dream, but shifted. The walls had changed angles slightly. The corners curved inward. The room leaned toward him like it was listening, and in that instant, every object in the apartment seemed placed with intention, like a message, waiting to be decoded. Books that had fallen from the shelf had landed spine up, spelling out a word, in titles he'd never noticed together before. Remember, the kitchen tiles, when seen from a certain angle, mimicked the same symbol on the back of the note. The scratch marks on the wall, a countdown dot, everything was a message. But a message from what? And more importantly, why? Elias collapsed into the armchair, his pulse pounding, eyes scanning the room for another pattern, another code. His instincts screamed the truth. His rational mind wouldn't say aloud. This wasn't random. This was a design. The entity wasn't trying to harm him, it was teaching him something, conditioning him. And in a moment of clarity, more terrifying than all the dreams and whispers combined, he realized it didn't want to hurt him. It wanted to be seen. The moment of truth the next night, Elias didn't try to sleep. He sat in the living room, surrounded by low candlelight. Electricity felt wrong, now too clean, too artificial. The soft flickering glow seemed to please whatever dwelled within the apartment. The hum behind the mirror had gone silent, and the air, though still dense with presence, had taken on a curious stillness, like the apartment was holding its breath. Elias stared at the 5 scratches on the wall, then at the note, "You invited it," then, finally, at the symbol again and again, trying to unlock whatever meaning pulsed beneath its geometry. Every line, every curve felt intentional, older than language. His heartbeat slowed as a terrifying clarity washed over him. This wasn't a haunting dot. It was a ritual. Each night, each whisper, each subtle shift was part of a sequence, one that required acknowledgement to progress, like the rules of a game. And Elias, unknowingly, had been following them, closing the mirror, tracing the scratches with his eyes, reading the note aloud. Even once, he had been playing along. He stood, light-headed but resolute, and walked toward the hallway. The towel still covered the mirror. The humming had returned, faint, like a distant memory, but it no longer frightened him. In fact, he understood now. The mirror wasn't just a reflection. It was a door, a threshold to whatever intelligence had slowly unfurled itself in his life. He reached out, fingers trembling. He peeled the towel away. His reflection stood as expected, but the lag was gone. It moved with him, in perfect sync. Except for one detail. The eyes. His reflection's eyes were open to open, black where white should be, glinting with a sentience that was not his own. They studied him, calmly. Neither blinked then. The reflection smiled. Not sinister, not comforting, just acknowledging. And that's when Elias heard the voice again. Not whispered, not disembodied. This time, it came from his own lips, without his control. "You're ready now." The lights in the apartment dimmed further, almost imperceptibly. In the mirror, the room behind him began to shift, walls bending subtly inward, shadows stretching like vines. His real room remained unchanged, but the mirrored version was becoming something else, something older, deeper, like the blueprint of a place that had existed long before the building had ever been constructed. Elias stared into it, into himself, or what had become of him. He should have run, screamed, broken the mirror into 1,000 pieces, but he didn't. He stepped closer. He reached out, not to destroy, but to touch, and the moment his fingers met the glass, it rippled. Like water. Behind the ripple, the other Elias leaned forward, pressing his own hand to the same spot. Two silhouettes mirrored across a threshold, and for the first time, Elias didn't feel afraid. He felt invited. The inevitability of dark didn't cross through the mirror, not entirely. Instead, he remained there, hand on glass, staring into the eyes of a version of himself that wasn't bound by skin, or rules, or reason. On the other side, his reflection seemed patient, watching, waiting. The smile had faded, replaced with an unreadable expression, like a being caught between expectation and pity. That silence, the thick, magnetic silence, returned. It wrapped around Elias like a shroud, not empty but full of something dense and vast and ancient, stretching beyond the edges of his comprehension. It wasn't just the room behind the glass that had changed, it was everything behind it. Time didn't pass there. The walls had no beginning or end. There were no doors, but somehow Elias knew there was no way out once you entered. And then, the mirror pulsed again just slightly. The air pressed in against his ears. "Choose." The voice came not from the mirror, nor from inside his mind, but from underneath his perception, like a drumbeat beneath consciousness, a command delivered through the rhythm of reality itself. Elias pulled back. His breath quickened. He stumbled away from the mirror, crashing against the hallway wall, candles flickering violently. In that moment of withdrawal, he expected the mirror to shatter, or the figure inside to reach out and drag him in. But nothing happened. No punishment, no pursuit, just watching, and the marks on the wall. They had changed. Where once there were 5 vertical scratches in a line, now there were 6. And this one was deeper, longer, final. Elias realized what it meant. The countdown wasn't to some apocalyptic event or arrival. It was his transformation, piece by piece. Each day, a part of his reality had shifted, been replaced. The quiet patterns, the whispers, the dreamlike distortions. They hadn't been hauntings, they had been preparations. He was becoming the thing, not possessed, not taken. Remade. He looked around his apartment and felt a crushing certainty settle in his chest. This is no longer my space. The arrangement of furniture, the layout of the windows, even the shadows themselves, they had subtly realigned over the past week. He couldn't prove it, but he didn't have to. The room had become a replica of what was behind the mirror, a rehearsal space for another geometry, a womb. That night, Elias tried to leave. He grabbed his keys, opened the front door and stepped into nothing. Not darkness, not void, just place. There were no walls, no hallway, no doorframe behind him. Just his apartment, perfectly intact, and then nothingness beyond its threshold. He slammed the door and backed away, shaking. He was no longer inside a building. He was inside the thing. Somewhere deep within, he realized, escape had never been possible. It had waited for him to try. It wanted him to try, to understand fully, finally, that there was no return, because only then could he be remade completely without resistance. The figure in the mirror, it was no longer smiling. It was mimicking him now, moving with him again. He had caught up, the fear that Elias never left that apartment. Not because he died, at least, not in the traditional sense, but because the version of him that once existed became something else, something quieter, a presence more felt than seen. The kind of thing you notice only in passing, a breath where there should be none, a flicker of reflection that doesn't belong to you, a shadow that forgets to follow your movements. The world outside moved on, oblivious. Mail piled at the door. The landlord assumed Elias had left in the night. Neighbors muttered about the sudden stillness from apartment 4B. Police knocked once, glanced around, and filed a report. Unresponsive tenant. No signs of struggle. No forwarding address. But inside, the apartment remained preserved untouched and sealed in a perfect stillness. Sometimes the candles still lit themselves at 3 a.m. Sometimes the scratches on the wall changed, and in the hallway mirror, even covered, even behind thick cloth, a pulse could be felt if you pressed your hand to it, like something breathing, waiting. Those who entered didn't always leave with answers, but none of them left unchanged. Some reported dreams that weren't their own memories of hallways they'd never walked, whispers and voices that carried no accent and no source. Others stopped speaking entirely after their visit, choosing silence over trying to explain what had followed them home, because that was the truth. Elias may have been the first, but he wasn't the last. The entity or force, or intelligence, or whatever it truly was, didn't want victims. It wanted mirrors. And Elias, whether by design or mistake, had become the prototype. He had followed the signs, had listened, had watched, and now he was part of it. Part of the silence that waits behind mirrors. Part of the shadow that doesn't match your outline. Part of the whisper you swear you heard, right before sleep takes you. No one saw Elias again. Not really. But if you stare long enough at your own reflection, late at night, with the lights off, and the house silent, if you hold your gaze just a little longer than feels comfortable, you might notice your reflection's eyes staying just a fraction too still. And if you listen, really listen, you might hear the softest voice say, "You invited it," and then, nothing. But the fear stays. Forever. Could you sleep after hearing this? What do you think really happened to Elias, and did he ever truly vanish? Let me know your thoughts in the comments, and if you dare, step into another tale before bed. Something's waiting.